Coming home from a deployment is supposed to feel like a victory. You count down the days, you replay that moment over and over in your head, stepping through the door, her arms around your neck, that feeling of relief that nothing changed while you were away. But my homecoming was different. I still remember the day clearly, sitting in the barracks, a few weeks before we were set to return. One of the other guys, Mark, had gotten a care package from home. He tore into it, letters falling out like confetti. Most of the guys were envious, and he joked about his wife sending him some homemade cookies to sweeten the wait. But I noticed I hadn't gotten much of anything recently. Not that it was weird for Emma, my wife. She was never one to send mushy letters, and we didn't really do the long, drawn-out I miss you stuff. But something felt off. It started small. A few ignored texts. Missed calls. Her being busy with work whenever I tried to video chat. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of being home alone. After all, being married to someone in the military isn't easy, and I couldn't expect her to sit around waiting for me like some 1950s housewife. She had her own life, and I respected that. But the doubts started creeping in like ants. One message too short, one call cut too quick. When I finally stepped off the plane, the first thing I noticed was how cold the air felt, even in August. Emma didn't come to pick me up. She'd gotten caught up at work. It wasn't like her, but I told myself not to overthink it. A buddy of mine dropped me off at the house, and I remember standing at the door for a second too long, breathing in, preparing myself for what was supposed to be a happy reunion. When I walked in, everything looked normal. The smell of her perfume lingered in the air, soft, familiar, comforting. But the house was quiet, almost too quiet. No warm welcome home, babe ringing through the air. No sign of Emma. Just a note on the counter saying she'd be home late. It didn't sit right with me, but I pushed it aside. Maybe I was being paranoid after all those months away. I unpacked my bag, showered, and tried to settle into the fact that I was back home. Then, later that night, I saw it. Her laptop was open on the dining table, screen dim, but not locked. I glanced at it, purely out of instinct, not because I was snooping. I was tired, jet-lagged, my head still swirling with the transition back to civilian life. But as I walked by, something caught my eye, an email notification. And it wasn't from work. The name wasn't familiar, but it was the subject line that stopped me in my tracks. Last night was incredible. I miss you already. My heart stopped. It felt like time froze for a second. I wanted to look away, to ignore it, but I couldn't. I clicked. The email thread opened up, and as I scrolled through the messages, a knot tightened in my stomach. There it was in black and white, details of a night she shared with someone else, a man named Jason. Explicit, graphic, intimate details of things I couldn't even process in the moment. I scrolled faster, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The dates lined up. Their affair had started almost immediately after I left. They were meeting regularly, at our house, in our bed. The emails weren't just about sex either. They were filled with plans, talks of a future together, even. He wasn't just some fling. He was someone she'd fallen for. Someone she was serious about. My world collapsed in that moment. The person I had trusted, the person I had spent years building a life with, had been living a lie. I felt sick, but there was something even worse. One of the last emails mentioned a date. A date just a few days away. The day I came back. They had plans to meet again, soon. That's when I knew this wasn't just some passing mistake. She had moved on. While I was overseas, giving everything to protect what I thought was a home worth fighting for, she was building a new one with him. It was like my entire life had been ripped out from under me. But instead of confronting her right away, I made a decision. I would gather everything. Every last piece of proof, every detail of their betrayal. I wasn't going to storm into a confrontation, fueled by anger and adrenaline. No, I wanted them both to feel it, her, and the man she was leaving me for. I decided to send it all to him. Let him see who she really was before they got any further. He had no idea she was married. She had painted herself as single, independent, waiting for a new beginning with him. And that new beginning was just around the corner, because the final email talked about moving in together. Soon. Little did they know, I was about to blow their whole world apart. The hardest part wasn't finding the emails. It was pretending like everything was normal after that. Emma walked in later that night, carrying a takeout bag and acting like it was just another day. She greeted me with a soft smile, kissing me on the cheek like she always did. "Hey, babe. Sorry I'm late, work was a mess," she said, casually dropping her bag on the counter like nothing had changed. I forced a smile. "No worries. Just glad to be home. As she went on about her day, talking about some new project at the office, I realized just how good she was at playing her part. Looking at her then, blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing her favorite simple blouse and jeans, it was hard to believe she could be capable of such betrayal. She had the perfect good wife image down to an art. You wouldn't think she was the kind of woman who'd be sneaking around behind her husband's back, orchestrating secret meetings with another man. But there she was, carrying on like the loving, devoted wife, while her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably him. It made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, I watched her closely, piecing together every little clue. She would leave for work at her usual time, but her routine was off. She was more distracted than usual, checking her phone constantly, disappearing for longer periods of time. When I offered to drive her to work one morning, she stiffened. Made some excuse about needing her own car for errands. Red flags I should have noticed months ago, but I had been halfway across the world, trusting her blindly. One night, after she'd fallen asleep, I decided to dig deeper. I knew there had to be more. Emails were one thing, but I wanted the whole picture. I wanted to know exactly how deep this went. So I opened her laptop again. She always left it lying around, never bothering to log out. Maybe she thought I'd never look. Or maybe she didn't care if I found out. I started with the obvious, her email. But after scrolling through some old messages, I hit the jackpot. She had been using a separate account, one I hadn't known about. An old Gmail account under a different name, probably something she thought I'd never think to check. But she wasn't as careful as she thought. That's where I found everything. The emails were worse than I imagined. It wasn't just the affair. It was the lies she had been feeding me for months. Excuses about late nights at work, missed calls, cancelled plans. She had been meeting him every chance she got, even taking weekends away together when I thought she was on work trips. They had their own little world, their own routines, their own life. And the more I read, the angrier I became. In one of the messages, she told him how much she missed him. She couldn't wait to move in together, to start their fresh, new life once I was out of the picture. My deployment had been the perfect excuse for her to set everything in motion, and I had been none the wiser. I read the words over and over again, feeling the rage build inside me. She wasn't even planning on telling me. She was going to let me come home, play along for a little while, then drop the bomb on me after everything was set with him. It was all there in her emails. The plans to sell the house, the deposit on their new apartment. She was ready to move out, ready to leave me behind like I was just some obstacle in her way. The man I'd trusted my life with overseas had turned out to be nothing compared to the person I'd left behind. That night, as she slept soundly next to me, I lay awake thinking about how I was going to make my move. Confronting her directly seemed too simple. She had been so calculating, so careful in orchestrating her new life behind my back. I wanted her to feel the same shock I felt when I found out. I wanted to pull the rug out from under her perfect little world. So I started planning. First, I collected everything, emails, text messages, even some photos they had exchanged. I saved it all, backed it up on a drive. I didn't want there to be any room for doubt when I finally made my move. Then, I started looking into him. Jason. He was just some guy from her office. An average guy, really, nothing special. I guess that made it sting even more. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He wasn't more successful than me, better looking, or smarter. He was just there. And somehow, that was enough for her to throw away everything we had built. But here's where it gets interesting. I found out that Jason had no idea she was married. In fact, she had been lying to him from the beginning. According to their messages, she had told him I was just some ex who wouldn't let go, that our relationship was long over, and she was waiting for the right time to officially end it. I couldn't believe it. Not only had she betrayed me, but she had spun this whole narrative where I was the problem. Where I was the one clinging on to a dead marriage, while she was just a poor, innocent woman trying to move on. I couldn't let her get away with it. I knew I had to hit them both where it hurt the most. And I had just the way to do it. But I had to wait for the perfect moment. Timing was everything. And that moment was coming soon. The days leading up to my plan were the hardest. Pretending like nothing was wrong, playing the part of the oblivious husband, while inside I was seething. Every morning, I would kiss her goodbye before she left for work, knowing full well she was probably rushing off to see him. She'd smile at me, that same warm smile she used to give me back when things were good, and it made my skin crawl. I wondered how many times she had looked at me like that, lying through her teeth. I had spent those first few days after finding out doing more research than I ever had to do on deployment. I learned everything I could about Jason. I found his social media accounts, looked into his background, even found out where he lived. He was exactly the kind of guy who believed he'd found some perfect woman in Emma. The kind of guy who thought he was saving her from a bad marriage, unaware that he was just the next pawn in her game. I could see it in the way they spoke to each other in their messages. She had him wrapped around her finger, feeding him lies, playing the victim. She made me out to be this controlling, distant husband, barely present in her life, and he ate it up. Every word. He was already making plans for their future, sending her links to apartments, talking about the places they'd visit once they were settled. It was disgusting. I didn't just want him to know the truth. I wanted him to see the whole picture. I wanted him to feel the same shock I had felt when I discovered their betrayal. So I compiled everything into a single email, photos, screenshots of their conversations, even some of the more intimate details she had shared with him. I wanted him to see who she really was, the lies she had told him, and the life she had been living behind both of our backs. I held off on sending it for a few days. I needed everything to be perfect. I wanted the timing to hit just right. In the meantime, Emma was acting more and more distant. She would stay late at work, or claim she had meetings with clients, though I knew exactly where she was going. One night, she came home with that same rehearsed smile, trying to act normal, but her guard was down. She slipped up. Maybe she thought I wasn't paying attention, or maybe she just didn't care anymore. But she left her phone on the counter while she showered, and it buzzed with a message from him. I wasn't proud of it, but I grabbed the phone and unlocked it using the password I had memorized from watching her unlock it hundreds of times. The message was simple: can't wait for Friday. Only a few more days till we're together for good. I felt my stomach turn. Friday. That was the day. The day they were planning to leave. She hadn't said a word to me, of course, but now I knew. They had a plan to meet that night, and from the looks of it, they were ready to move in together the next day. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell me, probably some bullshit story about how she couldn't take the distance anymore, or how we had grown apart. Maybe she'd blame my deployment, tell me the time away had changed her. Anything but the truth. That was my breaking point. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I spent that entire night awake, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I wondered what Jason would do when he found out. Would he leave her? Would he confront me? Confront her? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted him to see her for who she really was. I wanted him to feel the same gut-wrenching betrayal I had felt, the same disbelief that someone you trusted could be capable of such cruelty. The next morning, I woke up early, pretending I had plans with some friends. Emma barely acknowledged me. She seemed distracted, distant. She was probably thinking about how she was going to tell me, running through her rehearsed lines in her head. I watched her get ready for work, moving through the house like a stranger. It was strange, how someone you'd spent years with could suddenly feel like a complete stranger. I didn't know her anymore, not the way I thought I did. As she left the house, giving me a quick peck on the cheek, I made my move. I opened my laptop, pulled up the email I had drafted, and added a final message to Jason. "You're welcome." Then, with one last deep breath, I hit send. After hitting send, there was no going back. The moment the email left my outbox, I knew the damage was done. The proof was out there. Jason would have everything: the texts, the photos, the dates. He'd see exactly who Emma had been lying to, how she'd been playing both of us. Now, all I had to do was wait. That afternoon, Emma came home early. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard the door open. Her footsteps were hurried, more rushed than usual, like she was nervous about something. I didn't look up at first, just sat there, drinking my coffee, pretending to read something on my phone. I wanted to see if she'd say anything. I wanted to know if she'd try to lie one last time before everything unraveled. "Hey," she said, her voice unusually shaky. I glanced up, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't meet my eyes. She was fidgeting with her keys, avoiding eye contact, her entire demeanor off. "Hey," I responded casually, as if nothing was wrong. "You're home early." She gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, work was slow today. Figured I'd come home and spend some time with you." That was new. She hadn't cared about spending time with me for months. The sudden change in attitude made me suspicious. Something was off. I could feel it. We sat there in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke again. "Listen, I've been thinking," she started, her voice low, hesitant. "About us. About everything." Here it was. I could feel the speech coming. The one she had probably rehearsed in her head 100 times over the last few weeks. The one where she'd finally tell me she wanted to leave. But she didn't know I had already beaten her to it. I let her talk. I know we've been kind of distant lately, she continued, still refusing to meet my eyes. And I've been struggling with that. With the distance, with you being gone so much. I just feel like maybe we're not the same people we were when we first got married. And I think it's time for us to have a serious conversation about where this is going. It was the classic script. Blaming the time apart, blaming the changes that come with military life. The subtle way she tried to shift responsibility, painting herself as a victim of circumstance rather than someone who had been sneaking around behind my back for almost a year. But I stayed quiet. I wanted her to dig her own hole. I don't want to hurt you, she added, finally looking up at me. I just think maybe it's time for us to move on. Maybe we've both changed too much to make this work. I almost laughed. She still thought she could control the narrative, that she could walk away from this looking like the rational, reasonable one. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Just as she finished her little speech, her phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. Jason. I waited for her to pick it up, to glance at the message. And when she did, her face changed. Her eyes widened, her expression shifting from controlled calm to sheer panic. She turned away from me for a moment, checking her phone in a way she thought was subtle. But I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. Something was wrong, and she knew it. What's wrong? I asked, leaning back in my chair. I could barely hide the smirk that was threatening to break through. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. Nothing. Just work stuff. I raised an eyebrow. Work? It's Saturday, Emma. She froze. She knew I knew. She was caught, and she had no idea how to get out of it. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't bother hiding it. She opened the message, her hands shaking, her face paling as she read whatever Jason had sent her. She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. Did you do something? She stammered. I let out a slow breath and finally let my expression shift. I didn't need to pretend anymore. I'm not sure what you mean, Emma. Why don't you tell me? She stared at me, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I had seen. But it didn't matter anymore. She was already backed into a corner, and she knew it. You sent it to him, didn't you? She finally blurted out, her voice shaking. You sent something to Jason. I smiled. A slow, satisfied smile. I sent him the truth, Emma. All of it. Everything you've been hiding from both of us. Her face crumpled. She tried to hold it together, tried to keep up her facade, but it was crumbling fast. How could you? How could I? I interrupted, my voice sharp. How could you? While I was over there, risking my life, you were here screwing around with some guy from work. You lied to me. You lied to him. You think I didn't know? I've known for weeks, Emma. I read everything. She started crying, but the sight didn't even move me. Not anymore. I had nothing left for her, no sympathy, no understanding, nothing. She had drained it all with every lie, every betrayal. You can't just, she started, but I cut her off again. I already did. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't check it. She just stood there, broken, knowing that her entire world had just been shattered in one afternoon. The truth was out. Jason knew. And everything she had been planning, everything she had been building with him, was falling apart in front of her. She stood there for a few more moments, like she didn't know what to do, like she was waiting for me to offer some way out. But I didn't. There was nothing left to say. I stood up, walked past her without a word, and left the room. As I walked away, I could hear her sobbing quietly behind me. The rest of the day was a blur. Emma stayed locked in the bedroom for hours, probably trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't care anymore. I spent most of the afternoon on the couch, going through the motions of my usual routine, but my mind was elsewhere. The weight of what had happened hadn't fully hit me yet, but there was a strange sense of relief starting to settle in. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control again. I wasn't sure what Jason's next move would be. I wondered if he'd confront Emma directly, if he'd break things off immediately, or if he'd even show up at all. But part of me didn't care how it played out between them. My part was done. I had given him the truth, and whatever happened next was out of my hands. Around sunset, I heard her coming down the stairs. Her footsteps were hesitant, like she didn't know how to approach me. When she entered the living room, she looked like a completely different person. Her usual composed, confident self was gone. She was pale, her eyes red from crying, her hair a mess. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She stood there in the doorway, wringing her hands, looking like she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. I didn't say anything. I wanted her to speak first. To explain herself. To try, at least, to justify everything she had done. But she didn't. Instead, she sat down across from me, her shoulders slumped. He called, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, just nodded, waiting for her to continue. He said he can't do this anymore. That it's over. There it was. The end of her little fantasy. The fresh start she had been so excited for had come crashing down in a single phone call. And now, here she was, left with nothing. He knows everything, doesn't he? She asked, her voice shaking. Everything, I confirmed, my tone flat. She wiped at her eyes, trying to hold back more tears. I don't know what to say. I don't know how this happened. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. How this happened. Like it was some kind of accident. Like she hadn't been actively making choices to betray me for nearly a year. You made your choices, Emma, I said, my voice cold. You lied to me. You lied to him. You thought you could get away with it, and now everything's out in the open. She looked down at her hands, her lip trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry? I repeated, shaking my head. Sorry for what? For getting caught? For ruining our marriage? Or for losing him? She didn't answer, and that told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry because it hadn't worked out the way she planned. Because now, she was left with no one. I should have told you, she said after a long pause. I was going to, I swear. I just didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you. Her words rang hollow. I didn't believe a single thing she said anymore. How could I? She had spent months lying to my face, leading a double life, all while pretending to care about me. There was no coming back from that. What now? She asked, her voice small, defeated. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that whatever we had once shared was gone. There was no fixing this. No salvaging what was left. She had destroyed it all. I think you already know the answer to that, I said quietly. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Moving out, starting a new life. Well, now you're free to do that. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. So, that's it? We're done? I nodded. We've been done for a while, Emma. You just didn't tell me. She didn't argue. She didn't try to fight for us. Maybe she knew it was pointless, or maybe she had already checked out long before I found out about her affair. Either way, there was nothing left to say. Nothing left to do. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, the weight of everything hanging in the air between us. And then, without another word, she stood up and walked back upstairs. I heard her packing, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of her suitcase being dragged across the floor. By the time she came back down, it was dark outside. She had a bag slung over her shoulder, her face still streaked with tears, but there was a strange sense of finality in the way she moved. Like she knew this was the end. I'm going to stay with a friend, she said softly, avoiding my eyes. I'll come back for the rest of my stuff later. I just nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. Watching her walk out of that door for the last time, I didn't feel the pain I expected. Just a deep, exhausted relief. She was gone, and with her, the lies, the betrayal, and the fake life we'd been living. As the door closed behind her, I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space she had left behind. It was over. The marriage, the trust, everything. But somehow, I didn't feel broken. Just free. How would you handle discovering an affair after being away for a long time? Would you seek revenge or try to move on?